The sun blazed mercilessly above, turning the endless expanse of desert sand into a searing inferno. The air shimmered with heat, and the horizon seemed to dance mockingly in the distance, offering no promise of relief. Beneath this brutal sky, a mother dog limped forward, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Her coat, once a soft golden hue, was now matted with dust and sweat. Behind her, 3 tiny puppies staggered on unsteady legs, their soft whimpers barely audible over the desert wind. Her heart pounded not just from the relentless heat, but from the weight of her responsibility. She had no choice but to keep moving, though her body screamed for rest. The desert was unforgiving, and stopping meant death. Her eyes darted to the left and right, searching for any hint of shade, water, or salvation, but the desert offered nothing but its cruel indifference. The smallest puppy tripped and fell, letting out a faint cry. The mother stopped abruptly, her parched tongue hanging out as she turned back. She nudged the tiny creature with her nose, urging it to stand. Her movements were gentle, though her urgency was desperate. The puppy struggled to rise, its legs wobbly, but managed to follow her again. She knew she couldn't carry them all, not in this heat, but the thought of leaving even one behind was unthinkable. Her paws burned with every step, and her vision blurred. Still, she pressed on, driven by an instinct deeper than pain or fear. But as the sun climbed higher, her strength began to falter. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the scorching sand. The puppies circled her, their soft cries filled with confusion and fear. She tried to rise again, her body trembling violently, but it was no use. Her strength was gone. Lying there, the mother lifted her head weakly and looked toward the horizon. Her dry, cracked lips parted as though she were whispering a prayer, a silent plea to the heavens. The puppies huddled close, their small bodies trembling as the desert wind howled around them. Just as her vision began to fade, a faint shadow flickered in the distance. Something moving, something unfamiliar. She blinked, her breath shallow, as hope and doubt waged war in her heart. Could this be a miracle? Or was it just another cruel mirage? The shadow grew larger, its form slowly materializing against the shimmering heat waves. It was not a mirage. A figure, a man, was approaching, his silhouette outlined against the blazing horizon. The mother dog's instincts sharpened despite her weakness. She nudged her puppies closer, shielding them with her fragile body. Her breaths were labored, her body trembling, but her eyes stayed fixed on the figure. The man moved closer, his steps deliberate yet weary. He carried a bundle slung over his shoulder, his clothes tattered and face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat that shielded him from the sun. His posture was that of a wanderer who had spent too long in this desolate place. When he saw the dog and her puppies lying motionless on the sand, he stopped. For a moment there was silence, save for the wind's low moan. The man crouched down a few feet away, his eyes scanning the scene. The mother dog growled weakly, her protective instincts pushing through her exhaustion. The man didn't move closer. Instead, he reached into the bundle at his side and pulled out a small water flask. Slowly, he poured a few drops onto the sand, letting them trickle near the dog's nose. The scent of water hit her immediately, awakening something primal. She sniffed, her tongue flicking out instinctively. The man remained still, watching her closely. He poured a little more, this time onto a piece of cloth he tore from his shirt. Holding it out carefully, he waited. The mother hesitated, her eyes darting between the man and her puppies. The pups, oblivious to the tension, sniffed at the damp cloth and began licking it eagerly. The man spoke softly, his voice calm and unthreatening. "Easy now," he murmured, though he knew the dog wouldn't understand his words. He shifted slightly, lowering himself to the ground to appear less intimidating. The mother, torn between fear and desperation, made no move to attack. Instead, she allowed him to inch closer, her body still coiled with wary tension. He placed the damp cloth on the sand in front of her and backed away. Slowly, she leaned forward, her nose brushing against it before her tongue darted out. The cool moisture was a balm, though it was far from enough. She licked again and again, her strength flickering like a fragile flame. The man watched, a shadow of concern crossing his sunburned face. But then, as he reached back into his bundle, something caught the mother's attention, a faint glint of metal on his belt. Her ears perked, her growl deepening despite her exhaustion. The puppies froze, sensing her unease. The man noticed her change in demeanor and stopped moving, his hand hovering over the bag. His eyes locked with hers, a silent tension crackling between them. What was he hiding? And why did it feel like this encounter was more than just a chance meeting in the desert? The man slowly lowered his hand, his movements deliberate and measured. He held up the object, a small pocket knife. The blade glinted in the harsh sunlight, sharp but unthreatening in his loose grip. He laid it carefully on the sand between them, as if to show he meant no harm. Still, the mother dog's growl didn't waver. Her instincts screamed that trust could be fatal in a place like this. The man leaned back, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I'm not here to hurt you," he murmured, his voice carrying a weight of exhaustion and sincerity. He placed the knife back into his bag, careful not to make any sudden movements. Then he reached in again, pulling out something else, a piece of bread. It was stale, dry, but it smelled like food. He broke it into smaller chunks and tossed one gently toward the mother. The puppies, hungry and naive, pounced on the morsel immediately. Their tiny tails wagged as they gnawed at the dry bread. The mother remained still. Her sharp eyes locked on the man, but her body betrayed her weakening resolve. Her ribs heaved with shallow breaths, and the hunger gnawed at her insides like a relentless force. "I'll leave it here," the man said softly, placing the remaining bread a little closer to her before retreating a few steps. "You can take it when you're ready." The mother sniffed the air, the scent of food overpowering her caution. Slowly, she inched forward, her movements stiff and labored. Her puppies huddled around her, still nibbling at their small piece as she reached the bread and began to eat. Her eyes never left the man, but she ate with a desperation that spoke of days without sustenance. The man watched in silence, his expression unreadable. He adjusted his hat, shielding his face further from the sun, but there was something in his stance, a hesitation, a flicker of guilt or unease. His eyes drifted toward the horizon, scanning it as if expecting something, or someone. The mother finished the bread, licking the crumbs from the sand. Her strength was far from restored, but it was enough to sit upright. She barked once, a low, guttural sound warning the man to keep his distance. He nodded, as if understanding her unspoken demand. Then, without warning, a faint rumble echoed through the desert air. The man stiffened, his head snapping toward the sound. The mother's ears perked, her body tense as she pressed her puppies closer to her side. The rumble grew louder, steadier, and the man's hand drifted back to his bag, his fingers brushing against the knife. The tension in the air thickened as a shadow appeared on the horizon, this one larger, faster, and far less ambiguous than the man's had been. A vehicle. Dust kicked up in its wake as it sped toward them, a metallic glint under the unforgiving sun. The man's jaw tightened, his calm demeanor slipping for the first time. He muttered something under his breath, a curse or a prayer. It was hard to tell. He looked at the mother dog, his eyes filled with something new. Urgency. "Stay quiet," he whispered, though his words were meant more for himself than the dog. The mother didn't move, her instincts sharper than ever, as the approaching vehicle roared closer, carrying with it a promise of danger neither of them could ignore. The vehicle screeched to a halt a few yards away, its tires spitting sand into the air. The sound was jarring against the stillness of the desert, and the mother dog flinched, her puppies pressing closer to her trembling frame. The man didn't move, his body rigid, his hand hovering over the knife in his bag. His face was a mask of wariness now, his earlier calm completely erased. The truck's door creaked open, and a heavy-set man climbed out, his boots crunching against the hot sand. He was dressed in military-style fatigues, his face shadowed by a pair of dark sunglasses. Slinging a rifle over his shoulder, he scanned the scene with a calculating gaze before his lips curled into a smirk. "Well, well," the man drawled, his voice thick with a mocking tone. "Didn't expect to find company out here." The traveler didn't respond immediately. Instead, He slowly rose to his feet, his body positioned between the approaching man and the mother dog. His posture was tense but non-threatening, his hands visible at his sides. "Just passing through," he said, his voice steady but low. The newcomer chuckled, taking a step closer. "Passing through? Out here? You must be lost or hiding." The traveler's eyes flicked to the rifle, then back to the man's face. "Neither," he replied. His tone clipped. "I'm just looking for water." The man with the rifle raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. "Water, huh? And what's that behind you, strays?" He gestured toward the mother dog and her puppies with a tilt of his head. The traveler stiffened but didn't turn around. "They're harmless," he said quickly. "Just trying to survive, same as me." The other man scoffed, taking another step closer. "Harmless? That's a lot of mouths to feed in a place like this. You sure you're not carrying something valuable? People don't wander out here without a reason." The traveler clenched his jaw, his hand twitching near his bag. "I've got nothing," he said firmly. "Just leave us be." But the man with the rifle wasn't convinced. He crouched slightly, as if studying the dogs more closely. The mother growled low in her throat, her body trembling but her eyes blazing with defiance. The man laughed at the sound, a cruel edge to his voice. "Fiery little thing, isn't she? Shame about the pups, though. They won't last long out here." Something in his tone made the traveler take a half step forward, his body blocking the man's view of the dogs. "They're not your concern," he said, his voice dropping dangerously. "Move along." The air between them crackled with tension, the oppressive heat amplifying every sound, the soft growls of the mother dog, the crunch of the sand under the rifleman's boots, the faint clink of metal as he adjusted the weapon on his shoulder. For a moment, it seemed like neither man would back down. Then the rifleman's smirk faded, replaced by a hard, calculating expression. "You're hiding something," he said quietly, his hand drifting toward his weapon. "And I think I'll find out what." Before the traveler could respond, the mother dog lunged. Her body was weak, but her instincts were sharp, and she leaped toward the rifleman with a ferocity that defied her condition. The man stumbled back, startled, and the rifle slipped from his grasp, clattering to the ground. Chaos erupted as the traveler seized the moment, diving forward to grab the weapon. The rifleman cursed, scrambling to recover, but the mother dog barked and snapped at his legs, keeping him off balance. The puppies huddled together, their frightened cries piercing the air as the struggle unfolded in a blur of sand and fury. The traveler managed to get hold of the rifle, standing quickly and leveling it at the other man. "Enough!" he barked, his voice ringing with authority. The rifleman froze, his hands raised defensively as he stared down the barrel of his own weapon. The mother dog limped back to her puppies, her body quivering but her eyes still locked on the threat. The traveler's hands were steady, his expression unyielding. "Get in your truck and leave," he said coldly. "Now." For a moment the rifleman hesitated, his gaze darting between the traveler and the rifle. But something in the traveler's eyes, a cold determination that promised he wouldn't hesitate to pull the trigger, convinced him otherwise. Muttering a string of curses under his breath, the man backed away and climbed into his vehicle. The truck roared to life, and within seconds, it was speeding off into the distance, leaving a trail of dust in its wake. The traveler stood still for a long moment, the rifle still raised until the vehicle disappeared over the horizon. Only then did he lower the weapon, his shoulders slumping with exhaustion. He turned to the mother dog, who was now licking her puppies, her own body swaying with fatigue. "You're tougher than you look," he murmured, a hint of admiration in his voice. But as he looked down at the rifle in his hands, his expression darkened. The danger wasn't over. Not. The traveler dismantled the rifle quickly, tossing the key components into the sand far from each other. He couldn't afford for it to fall into the wrong hands again, especially not with danger so close. He wiped the sweat from his brow and knelt beside the mother dog. Her breathing was heavy, her body trembling with the aftermath of the encounter, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the horizon for any sign of further threat. "You saved us back there," he said softly, his voice carrying a mix of gratitude and amazement. He reached into his bag again, this time pulling out the last of his water. He poured a small amount into his hand, extending it toward her cautiously. She hesitated for only a moment before lapping it up, her tongue rough and desperate against his skin. The puppies followed suit, crowding around his hand, their tiny tails wagging despite their exhaustion. The man sighed, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He knew the riflemen wouldn't give up so easily. Men like that didn't take kindly to humiliation, and the traveler had no doubt he'd return, perhaps with others. Time wasn't on their side, and the searing heat of the desert wasn't forgiving. The traveler stood, scanning the barren landscape for options. His gaze fell on a distant ridge, its rocky face offering the faintest promise of shade and cover. It wasn't much, but it was something. "We need to move," he said, though he knew the dogs couldn't understand him. Still, the mother seemed to sense his urgency. She rose slowly, nudging her puppies to follow. The journey to the ridge was grueling. The sand felt heavier with every step, and the sun seemed to bear down even harder, as if mocking their struggle. The mother stumbled several times, her legs barely able to support her. Each time the traveler stopped, offering her a moment to recover. He carried the smallest puppy in his arms, its tiny body limp with fatigue, while the other two trudged close behind. When they finally reached the base of the ridge, the traveler collapsed against the rocks, his chest heaving. The shade was minimal, but it was enough to provide some relief. He set the puppy down gently, and it crawled toward its siblings, curling up beside them. The mother lay down, her head resting on the cool stone, her eyes half closed but still watchful. The traveler pulled out his knife, carving small notches into the rock to mark their position. He needed to stay alert, to plan. They couldn't stay here forever. The desert was vast, but it wasn't empty. He had seen signs, tire tracks, faint remnants of campfires, that hinted at civilization not far off. If they could just hold out a little longer, they might have a chance. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the desert in hues of orange and red, the traveler's unease grew. The ridge offered some cover, but it also made them visible against the open landscape. He stood, scanning the horizon again, and that's when he saw it. A thin trail of dust rising in the distance, growing larger by the second. The rifleman was coming back, and this time, he wasn't alone. The traveler's heart pounded as he turned to the mother dog. "Stay with them," he whispered, his voice urgent. Gripping his knife tightly, he moved to the edge of the ridge, his mind racing. He had no weapon, no backup, and no time, but he wasn't about to let the rifleman take anything more. Not from him, not from them. As the vehicles approached, he crouched low, his body blending into the shadows. The mother dog let out a low growl, her body trembling but her spirit unbroken. The puppies whimpered softly, unaware of the danger closing in. The traveler took a deep breath, his jaw tightening as he prepared for what felt like an impossible fight. The desert wind carried the sound of engines closer, louder, a relentless reminder of what was coming. He glanced back at the mother dog, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. In her gaze, he saw something unexpected, a fierce determination, a spark of defiance that mirrored his own. Together they would face what was to come, no matter the cost. The roar of engines grew deafening as the vehicles came into view. 2 trucks kicking up clouds of dust as they barreled toward the ridge. The traveler pressed himself closer to the rock, his knife gripped tightly in his hand. He knew he was outmatched. 2 trucks, more men, and likely more weapons. But he wasn't backing down. He glanced over his shoulder at the mother dog and her puppies. Their survival depended on him, and he wouldn't let them down. The first truck came to a halt at the base of the ridge, its tires skidding in the sand. 4 men jumped out, their faces hardened, their movements deliberate. The rifleman was among them, his earlier smirk replaced with a look of cold determination. He barked orders to the others, pointing toward the rocks. "They're up there, spread out, I want that man alive." The traveler's pulse quickened. Alive. That meant they wanted something from him, something he didn't even know he had. He scanned the terrain, searching for any advantage, any way to even the odds. The ridge was steep, its rocky surface uneven and treacherous. If he could force them to climb, it might slow them down. The mother dog let out a sharp bark, drawing the traveler's attention. She stood now, her body low to the ground, her teeth bared in a silent snarl. Her puppies huddled behind her, their tiny bodies pressed against the cool rock. The traveler nodded at her, as if they shared an unspoken understanding. "Hold them back as long as you can," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if the words were for her or himself. The men began their ascent, their boots crunching against the loose stones. The traveler moved quickly, circling around to a higher vantage point. He needed to split them up, create confusion. He grabbed a loose rock and hurled it toward the far side of the ridge. It struck with a loud crack, sending shards tumbling down the slope. One of the men shouted, turning toward the sound. "Over there!" he yelled, breaking off from the group. The traveler seized the moment, moving swiftly toward the nearest man. The element of surprise was his only weapon. He lunged, the knife flashing in his hand, and tackled the man to the ground. A brief struggle ensued, the traveler's desperation giving him strength. With a final shove, he knocked the man unconscious, grabbing his weapon before darting back into the shadows. The commotion drew the attention of the others. "He's here!" the rifleman shouted, his voice echoing through the ridge. The remaining men quickened their pace, their weapons drawn. The traveler ducked behind a jagged rock, his breathing shallow. He could feel the weight of the pistol in his hand, its unfamiliarity unnerving. He didn't want to use it, but he knew he might have no choice. Meanwhile, the mother dog stood her ground, her growls growing louder as one of the men approached. She lunged at him, her teeth snapping inches from his leg. He cursed, stumbling back and raising his weapon. But before he could fire, the traveler emerged from the shadows, the pistol aimed steadily at the man. "Drop it!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The man froze, his finger hovering over the trigger. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a reluctant scowl, he lowered his weapon, tossing it to the ground. The traveler kicked it away, his eyes darting toward the rifleman, who was now climbing higher, his gaze fixed on the puppies. "Don't even think about it," the traveler yelled, his voice laced with fury. The rifleman hesitated, his expression darkening. "You're outnumbered," he sneered. "You think you can protect them? You can't even protect yourself." The traveler's grip tightened on the pistol. "Try me," he said, his voice cold and steady. The rifleman smirked, but before he could make his move, a deafening sound split the air. A helicopter's rotor blades cut through the desert wind, its shadow sweeping over the ridge. Both men looked up in shock as the chopper descended, its doors sliding open to reveal armed figures in uniform. A voice boomed through a loudspeaker. "This is a restricted area. Stand down immediately." The rifleman's smirk vanished, replaced by pure rage. He glanced at the traveler one last time before darting back toward his truck. His men followed suit, scrambling into their vehicles as the helicopter circled above. Within moments, the truck sped off, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a tense silence. The traveler lowered the pistol, his hands trembling. He turned to the mother dog, who stood panting but vigilant, her puppies still tucked safely behind her. Relief washed over him as he dropped to his knees, his strength finally giving out. The helicopter landed nearby, and two uniformed men approached cautiously. "You all right?" one of them asked, his tone laced with suspicion. The traveler nodded, his voice hoarse. "Just trying to survive." One of the men glanced at the dogs, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Looks like you've go." The uniformed men helped the traveler to his feet, their expressions a mix of curiosity and professionalism. The helicopter's rotors hummed steadily behind them, stirring up the hot desert air. One of the men gestured toward the ridge. "We've been tracking unauthorized activity in this area for weeks. Those men, they weren't locals. Do you know what they wanted?" The traveler shook his head, wiping the sweat from his brow. "They didn't say, just seemed intent on causing trouble." The man frowned, exchanging a glance with his colleague. "Trouble is an understatement. They're part of a smuggling ring we've been trying to shut down. You're lucky we spotted them." The traveler's gaze shifted to the mother dog and her puppies. "Lucky, yeah," he muttered, his voice tinged with weariness. He knelt beside the dogs, running a gentle hand over the mother's back. She flinched slightly at first, but then leaned into his touch, her trust hard-earned. The puppies wagged their tiny tails, sensing the easing tension. The second officer crouched down, studying the dogs. "They're in bad shape. You too, by the look of it." He nodded toward the helicopter. "We've got supplies on board, food, water. Let's get you all patched up." The traveler hesitated, glancing at the helicopter. "And then what? This isn't exactly a place you can just walk away from." The first officer smiled faintly, his tone softening. "We'll get you out of here. There's a shelter not far from our base. They take in animals, help rehabilitate them. You could go there, with them." The traveler looked back at the mother dog. Her eyes met his, and for a moment he saw the same resilience that had kept him going. "We've come this far together," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I'm not leaving them now." The officers nodded, motioning toward the helicopter. "Come on, let's get moving." The mother dog hesitated as the traveler began to guide her toward the chopper. The loud noise of the rotors unsettled her, and she barked nervously, her puppies cowering beneath her. The traveler knelt beside her, speaking softly. "It's okay. You're safe now. I won't let anything happen to you." With a few more gentle reassurances, the mother finally relented, following him up the ramp. The puppies stumbled after her, their small paws slipping slightly on the metal surface. Inside, the officers handed the traveler a bottle of water and a pack of rations. He shared the water with the dogs first, watching as they drank eagerly. The smallest puppy licked at his hand, its tiny tongue cool against his skin. As the helicopter lifted off, the traveler looked out over the vast desert below. The ridge grew smaller, the endless dunes stretching far beyond it. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to breathe deeply. The danger was behind them, at least for now. The officer seated across from him broke the silence. "What's your story, anyway? Not every day we find someone out here, let alone with a pack of dogs." The traveler hesitated, his gaze drifting to the mother dog. "Just trying to find my way," he said after a moment. "Same as them." The officer nodded, sensing there was more to the story, but deciding not to press. Instead, he leaned back, watching as the horizon began to shift, the desert giving way to a faint outline of civilization in the distance. The traveler turned his attention back to the dogs. The mother had finally closed her eyes, her body relaxing for the first time since he'd met her. Her puppies were curled up against her, their tiny chests rising and falling with steady breaths. He reached out, gently brushing his fingers over the smallest one's fur. "We made it," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if the words were for them or for himself. But even as they flew toward safety, the traveler couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The desert had a way of leaving its mark, and the bond he'd formed with these dogs was something he couldn't walk away from. They had saved each other, and in that moment, he knew his journey wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finding a place they could call home, together.